All right, I'm going to show you a few different sentences, and let's think about what there is in common between them. So let's think about sentences like, girls are bad at math, Americans are individualistic, ducks lay eggs, mosquitoes spread malaria. You might think some of these are true, you might think some of these are false. Like, for example, hopefully, if you're not a sexist, you will not agree with the first sentence. But what these sentences have in common is they are all what is called generics. They're sentences that take some group, like ducks, and they make a generalization about some property that group has, like they lay eggs. The special thing about these sentences is it's actually not clear what they mean. So if you have a sentence like this about a specific person or specific thing, it's easy to explain its meaning. So if I point at some girl and say, that girl is bad at math, that sentence has a specific meaning, right? I'm pointing out some person or some entity in the world, and I'm saying that there are two things that are true about that entity. One, she's a girl. Two, she's bad at math. And it's easy to judge if that sentence is true or false. But if I turn it into a generic sentence, like girls are bad at math or ducks lay eggs or something, it's hard to tell what that really means. Does that mean all of them? Does it mean all girls are bad at math? Does it mean most girls are bad at math? Does it mean being bad at math is an essential property of being a girl or something like that? And you can probably tell from these sentences that these meanings don't always seem consistent, right? So people often interpret these as meaning all of this thing or that. So that might be a reason why a reasonable person would reject the sentence, girls are bad at math, because you would say, no, not all girls are bad at math. But it's not clear that it really means all girls, right? You think of a sentence like ducks lay eggs. Most people will say that's true. But is it true that all ducks lay eggs? Actually, it's not, right? Because about half of ducks are male. Male ducks don't lay eggs. Baby ducks don't lay eggs because they're not yet old enough to lay eggs. Ducks that are maybe too old or too sick might not lay eggs. Even a female duck who can lay eggs is not laying eggs all the time. So people will usually accept this sentence as true, ducks lay eggs, but it's not true that all ducks lay eggs. So there's kind of some lack of clarity about what generic sentences mean. So in this module, I want to share about a pretty interesting experiment that was done to look at how people understand generic sentences. So this is a screenshot of the beginning of the paper that described that experiment. And actually, the title of the experiment tells you all you need to know about what this experiment found. So, generic statements require little evidence for acceptance, but have powerful implications. So the first part of that, little evidence for acceptance, that means people will often, if they hear a generic sentence, they will often assume that it's true. And they only need a few examples of evidence to support it. So for example, say mosquitoes spread malaria. Actually, maybe it's only 1% of mosquitoes that spread malaria, but we see a few cases where mosquitoes spread malaria, so we accept that that sentence is true. The second half of the title of this paper, generic statements have powerful implications. That means that once we accept a generic statement is true, we assume that it applies to all or most of that group. So we don't need much evidence to decide that it's true, but then once we decide it's true, we generalize, right? We spread that to a much bigger group than what we've seen. So that's one of the special things about generic sentences. Now let's look at the experiment that these researchers did to find that conclusion. So in this experiment, they actually did two different things. So they did two different kinds of surveys that tested people's understanding in two different ways. One of the ones that they did was a survey to measure whether people accept generic statements based on how much evidence there is. So for example, they would show somebody a context where they would always make up some made up words or some made up creatures. So they give them some context about lorches. A lorch is some kind of made up alien creature or whatever. And they told the people, so 30% of lorches have purple feathers. And then they gave them a sentence, lorches have purple feathers. And they asked people, is that sentence true? And then the other task that they did was they flipped it around. They just told people the sentence without a context. So they told people, lorches have purple feathers. And then they asked people, what percentage of lorches do you think have purple feathers? So the key results are what we see here. You can ignore the right-hand side that says most and look at the left-hand side that says generic. There's two bars here. A white bar is truth condition. So that's the results of the first test I mentioned, where they told people 30% of lorches have purple feathers, and then they gave them the sentence, lorches have purple feathers, and asked them, do you think it's true or false? How high the bar is tells you how many lorches need to have purple feathers before people will accept the sentence, lorches have purple feathers. And in this example, it was about 70%. So people will accept the sentence, lorches have purple feathers, if 70% of lorches have purple feathers. They did the experiment in a lot of different ways, and it varied a lot. There were some situations where people might accept the sentence with only 50% or even less. The gray bar is the second task they did. So where they just gave the sentence to people, they said, lorches have purple feathers, and then they asked those people to guess how many lorches have purple feathers. So in that task, people guessed that maybe like 95% of lorches have purple feathers. And again, this varied based on different ways they did the test. So the important thing here is this difference between the two bars, right? So you see that people will accept the sentence, lorches have purple feathers. They will consider that sentence true if only 70% of lorches have purple feathers. But then they will turn around and think that that sentence means 95% of lorches have purple feathers. So this is what the title of that paper was saying. This is the asymmetry that we see with generic statements, that you don't need much evidence to think that it's true, but then you will assume it applies to much more than the evidence that you've seen. So this is the bottom line about generic statements, that they imply some kind of broad generalization, often without much evidence. So people can use generic statements to imply things with little evidence. In fact, this is very common in political discourse when people talk about political things or any kind of arguments. So it can be pretty dangerous, and it's something that you want to keep an eye out for. So you can tell if, for example, if someone is trying to manipulate you or trying to manipulate your beliefs by using generic statements. So for example, here are a few sort of politically related statements that are kind of things you might hear in topics being discussed nowadays. So things like vaccines work, politicians don't care about the working class, universities are run like businesses. So the thing is, actually, these are all statements that I personally would agree with, but we have to be careful because these are all generic statements, right? So these are the kinds of things that someone who says these sentences might say them with a small amount of evidence for it and then use it to make a broad generalization about all vaccines or all universities or something. So this is one of the things that's tricky and potentially risky about generic statements. So it's always good to be aware if you see people using generic statements that you have to think clearly about what that actually means and what the evidence for it is.